Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and welcome to the latest episode of the Hard Compound Live. For those of you who don't know, my name's Rich and I run and operate the Hard Compound. We're a one-stop shop for all things motorsport. We can be found on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and Instagram. So do search for us on all those platforms if you use them. And give us a follow so you don't miss out on all the good motorsport stuff that we have for you. We try and bring you some motorsport 2 or 3 times every day across Facebook, Twitter and Instagram mainly. These are done in the form of race reviews, race previews, any breaking news, any car or bike unveils, any driver news, throwbacks, birthdays, or just nice pictures of cars and bikes that we like. And we cover everything from Formula One to touring cars to the World Endurance Championship to IMSA, IndyCar, NASCAR, rallying, bikes, and anything else that we haven't mentioned. Really, we try and cover it as best we can to give you the broadest spectrum that we can in the world of motorsport. So in case you hadn't noticed, we also do live interviews. These go out on our Facebook, our Twitter and our YouTube. They're all streamed live, just as this one is right now, and they are saved automatically. So if you go to YouTube into the live section, they're all saved on there. If you're on Facebook, they're in the videos section, and they're all saved on there. We've had some fantastic guests. I can't name them all, but just to give you an idea, we've had the honour and the privilege of speaking with the likes of Mr. John Watson just last week. We've also spoken with 2 further legends in the shape of Mario Andretti and Jackie Ickx. We've spoken with the likes of Martin Donnelly, Carl Wendlinger. We've spoken with like Karen Chandhok, Roberto Guerrero, Mika Salo, Mark Sura, Emanuele Pirro, Alex Palou, Scott Pruitt, Brian Herter, Willie T. Ribbs, Alonso Jr., Danny Sullivan, Ari Lyondike, Jason Plato, Rob Gravitt, Matt Neal, John Clellan, Steve Soper, Gabriele Tarquini, Anthony Reid, Ivan Muller, etc., etc., etc. And if you like your bikes, we've spoken with Mr. Terry Reimer, Shane Byrne, and many others. So do go and check them out, but don't do it just yet, because we have, in my mind, another legend of British motorsport. He's raced in Formula One, the Shell Sports Series. He's raced in British Formula One, endurance racing, Le Mans, BTCC, much, much more. You name it, he's probably raced it. So without any further ado, I'm going to stop rambling and we're going to bring him in. So please join me in extending a very, very warm welcome to Mr. Mike Wilds.
Hello, good evening.
Evening, Mike. How are you?
I'm good, Rich. Thanks. Thanks for asking me to come and chat with you.
Well, I've been wanting to get you on for a while, but I thought he's not going to want to come and talk to me. But it's we've got to say thank you to a go-between. We've got John Cavill, who's put us in touch. So thank you. Yeah, thank you very much to John. But yeah, Mike, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great doing some research into this. I can't wait to hear about your career. It's been well, and it's still going, isn't it?
Well, yes. Even though I'm old, I can't get rid of that motorsport passion from my tummy yet. So hopefully, there's a few more races and possibly a few more wins left in me yet.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's no sign of stopping, I'm assuming, and why should there be? If you love it, you've got to do it. So yeah.
Well, I have a very large poster here. I'm sitting in my little small office at home, but downstairs I have a poster, and it's got a beautiful picture of a 917 on the middle. On the top, it says, "You don't stop racing when you get old. You get old when you stop racing." So that's my motto.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I never started racing, so I don't know where that puts me. But for guys such as yourself, that's absolutely the way to live. Just before we get cracking, just want to turn my attention to the comments section. We've got a few people putting some comments in already. Thank you very much. If you have any questions and any comments, do put them in. We'll see them roughly in real time, and we'll try and work them into our chat. Excuse me, and that's on Facebook, YouTube, and on Twitter as well. Yeah, we've got quite a bit to get through this evening, which I can't wait to get stuck into. I guess the best place to start is right at the start. Where did your interest first sort of come from when it came to motorsport?
Well, I suppose the very first interest came through my brother, Johnny, who sadly is no longer with us. But my brother raced motorcycles back in the late 50s, early 60s. And without my parents' knowledge, they often wonder why he had a van and didn't have a car. And the van was basically to drive to a friend's house on a Saturday morning. The two of us would go to a friend's garage, pick up his race motorcycle and go off to Brands Hatch or wherever and go motorbike racing. So I think that's probably where I got the bug of motorsport and why I still have a love for motorcycles. But my love for car racing came about through a garage. I was born in Chiswick in West London, and in Chiswick High Road there was a company called the Checkered Flag, and I would ride past there on my bicycle when I was 11, 12 years old and look at Lotus 11s and Jaguar D-types and so on that were for sale in the showroom, and I was fascinated by these cars. And I was there so often that they offered me a Saturday job washing cars, which were for sale. I grabbed that with both hands, and I met their mechanic. His name was Chaz Beattie, and he was the man that was building the Checkered Flag's Formula Junior cars. They were called Geminis, and he ran two cars for the flag, and one was driven by Ross Grenville and one by Roy Pike. And he took me to the workshop and showed me these racing cars, and I fell in love. Basically, I fell in love with these racing cars, and
it was like a light bulb moment.
Yeah,
it was that.
Yeah, but the real eureka moment was that one day Chaz said, "Well, do you want to come to a race meeting?" And I said, "Yes, please." But of course, my age, he said, "Well, go and ask your parents if that's okay." And they very kindly said yes. And I met Chaz very, very early one Saturday morning, and we went off to Brands Hatch in the Checkered Flag Transporter with these Mark 4A Gemini Formula Juniors in the back. And the eureka moment came. We stopped in the paddock. I got out of the door, and there was a noise, and there was a smell, and an atmosphere that absolutely blew me away. And I swear that actually, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life.
Wow.
And that's where it started.
And what's great, I'm sure everyone who's either watching this live or is going to watch it back can relate to that. We had the same thing. I was at Snetterton, was it 10 days ago for the British touring cars. I'm just walking around the paddock. I sort of got to know a few people through doing this, and all of a sudden you just hear, it's all quiet, and then all of a sudden you hear the roar of something, and then a waft out the back of the garage, and you still get that, oh. And I'm sure you probably still get it today, don't you?
Oh, I can't tell you. When I go to a racetrack, 'cause I coach drivers who want to drive basically on track days faster, really, rather than race drivers. But I feel totally at home at a racetrack. I go through the gate and I feel pleasantly warm. I don't want to be anywhere else. And I'm talking to like-minded people about the passion I have for driving quickly and motorsport. And hopefully that will never, ever fade. It's not faded. I had my first race 58 years ago, and it's never faded, not an iota.
I don't think it's going anywhere.
No.
Yeah, why would it? Fantastic. I've just seen a lovely comment just in the on YouTube. I believe it's your grandkids are in. You've got Spencer and Holly.
Oh, right, lovely.
They just said hello. So, hello. Thank you for tuning in. That's lovely. Keep it in the family. Love that.
Spencer, I think, is fantastic because he's the third generation of our family that started racing. my son Anthony is Spencer's father. I've won a few races with Anthony. He's won 3 championships. And now Spencer has started winning kart races, which is great.
Excellent.
Makes me very proud of him.
Yeah, absolutely. That's brilliant to hear. So, I mean, you know, you can obviously tell how much you love motorsport. You had that moment where you thought, "This is what I want to do." When did you first get the chance to do it? When did you first? Was it in a cart, or did you get to sit in with someone, or did someone take you
No,
around at a daft speed or something?
no, I mean, karting was in its infancy.
Sure.
I joined the 750 Motor Club in 1964. I left school as soon as I possibly could, because I wanted to be involved in motorsport. And I eventually I got a job at the Checkered Flag as a junior salesman, and I went obviously to race meetings with them. I met Mike Spence, and Jackie Stewart drove their Lotus Elans, the
Wow.
work Lotus Elans, and I didn't have any tuition. I didn't do any karting. I just knew I had to have a racing car. I needed to buy a racing car. So I'd work at the Checkered Flag 5 or 6 days a week. But I worked in, I think it was called the King's Head, in Kew Green, which was very close to Chiswick. I worked there as a barman in the evenings, 6 or 7 nights a week to save money. And I joined the 750 Motor Club Special Builders Group, which was, they met once a month in a room over a pub in Battersea in southwest London. And I'd go there every month. And it was fascinating for me because there were people attending that group, people like Eric Broadley, who started Lola racing cars, Colin Chapman, and they would talk about how they were building their specials. And I learned so much, which helped me understand when I started to drive racing cars. I had all this sort of technical information that I gathered from this pub in Battersea in southwest London. So I'd probably saved about £50. Now, bear in mind, I was probably earning 3 and 6 on a green apple at the time.
Sure.
£50 was a lot of money. And I met at the 750 Motor Club in mid-1964 a man called Lou Bergonzi. And Lou was racing a DRW Mark 1 in the 750 Motor Club's 1172 Formula. And just in conversation, he said that he was going to buy, at that time, a Lotus 23 copy called a Millmore, and beautiful, pretty little rear engine race car. And he said, so I'm selling the DRW. I tentatively said, okay, how much do you want for it? And he said £280, including the trailer. Now, £280 today is nothing, but to me, on probably 5 or 6 quid a week, was a different world.
Yeah.
So I got home, spoke to my parents, and I had enough for a deposit. And very kindly, my parents stood guarantor for a loan, and I borrowed £230 and bought the car.
Fantastic.
I hadn't really thought it through because I had a motorbike at the time, and we lived in the top flat of a house in Chiswick with no garage, and I hadn't really thought it through. So one foggy night, late 1964, Lou rolled up out of the murk with this car on the back of on the trailer on the back of towing his. He was towing it with his car. He unhitched it. I'd paid him the money, and he disappeared. And there I was, the owner of a racing car, with absolutely no money. at all.
And
So
nowhere to keep it.
my father was tremendously, he was a press photographer by trade. He was so supportive. He couldn't be supportive financially because he didn't earn a lot of money.
Sure.
And we put a tarpaulin over it, and it sat there for month after month. We used to go down in the evenings and start it up and make sure everything was good. And I started to save so that I could try and enter a race.
Right. Wow.
I eventually managed to enter a race in May 1965. So probably 6 months after the car was delivered, but nobody ever touched it. It sat there all the time and nobody touched it. And
Wow.
we put a tow hitch on the back of my mum's Morris Minor 1000. And the first race I entered was in May 1965, so 58 years ago. And we had to leave the night before for the race to Snetterton, as it was on the old Snetterton circuit, because the Morris Minor, with myself, my father, my mother, and my brother in it, plus the racing car on the back and the toolbox, wouldn't go more than about 20 miles an hour.
That's quite
motorways. So we went cross country. So we left in the middle of the night to get there in time for signing on the morning of the race.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, firstly, if you bought a race car these days and left it at the side of the road in Chiswick, I'm pretty sure, not there's anything wrong with Chiswick, of course, but just society in general, somebody would do something to it, wouldn't they?
Absolutely.
But that's incredible, and it's all self-funded as well. You know, with the loan and everything. But that's amazing. As I mentioned, we were talking to John Watson last week, and he said that he self-funded a lot of things, and it's increasingly difficult to do that these days, isn't it? To self-fund.
I mean, motorsports changed. It's a business now rather than a sport. Okay, club racing, yes, everybody's basically funding it for themselves, I'm sure, in the 750 Motor Club and so on. It was difficult. I could only race when I'd saved enough money to race. So
like a real hand-to-mouth type thing.
Out of the 15 rounds of the championship, it was an 1172 Formula car, so it had a 100E side valve engine and a 3-speed close ratio gearbox. I could only do half the races.
Right.
There are about 30 or 40 cars in the championship. And on those 7 races, I finished 7th overall, which was pretty good effort, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that first race at Snetterton, I had no idea, not a clue what I was doing, really. I had tested the car at Silverstone, because when I said to Lou, yeah, I'll buy it, but I have to sort out to borrow the money. He said, well, before you do that, you ought to drive it and see if you like it and want to buy it.
Sure.
So he very kindly took it to Silverstone Club Circuit, and I did a few laps in the car, and it was just the best thing ever, just to drive this little car with its little 3-speed gearbox and, I don't know, 50 horsepower or whatever it was the most exciting thing I'd ever done in my life. And so obviously I went ahead and bought it. But we arrived at Snetterton and I had no idea. People told me where to go. You have to go and sign on. You have to go to scrutineering, and they'll call you and you'll go to the assembly area ready to go out for your practice, and they will time you, and that will put you on. I sort of basically knew that from going with the Formula Juniors with the checkered flag, but to then, after practice, just learning the circuit, to sit on the grid, I was a little bit closer to the back than I was at the front of the grid. Sure. But somebody said there'll be a man who'll go up on this little podium, a few steps on the side, left-hand side of the track. He'll raise a Union Jack or a Union flag, and he would drop it. And when he drops it, away you go. You're racing. He said, but he gave me a tip. He said, "Don't watch the flag." He said the elbow always moves first when he's going to do the flag. So I sat there. I was so nervous. I can't tell you how nervous I was.
I can
So
imagine.
I just gave it a few revs when he climbed up on the podium to drop the flag, and I just watched his elbow. And when his elbow twitched, I dropped the clutch and disappeared, and got to riches with nobody in front of me, which
Oh wow.
wiggled through all these people. But being very naive, I put the brakes on, and of course, everybody then just went past me. It was hilarious, but I learned so much in that race. I diced with a man called Cyril Lyford. I'll never forget his name. Used to have the long Norwich Straight, and we were going along Norwich Straight side by side, looking at each other, smiling and then waving to lorries that were going along the A11. We
Terrific.
were just having the best fun ever. And I had no idea where I was. I had no pit signals or anything, so I just was going round and round and round. And I overtook a few people, and Cyril led me through, and I learned it slipstream down the straight. And I overtook him eventually, and I took the checkered flag. I had no idea where I was, and I finished third overall. So
In
I
the
came
first
home
ever
with
race.
a trophy that was this big, and it is in this office somewhere. And we all drove home with a huge smile on our face, and a little trophy went on the cabinet at home.
Amazing for a first right in, and it's lovely to get the result. But as you say, it's good. It still rings true in anything you do, isn't it? The best way to learn is by doing it.
Yeah,
Following people around, watching what they're doing,
yeah.
taking the best bits from them. And it sounds like you did that. And to come, and to go home with a smile on your face, finishing third, it's not a bad start, is it? That's
No.
fantastic.
And it was quite amazing because I went to Silverstone for the second race that I could afford to do, and I'd been there because I'd done a few laps when I tested the car, so that was great. So I came second in that one. By the time I'd saved up enough money again, the third race I could do coincided with another Silverstone race. And yesterday, the 30th of May was yesterday, and that was the date I won my first ever race.
Yeah.
30th of May in 1965. So 58 years ago yesterday, I had my first win.
Wow.
The only one I've ever had.
I must actually say thank you actually to because I wasn't aware of that. I saw you put it up on your Instagram, but before that, on our Facebook page, your co-author Jeff, who is in tonight,
Oh
hello
yeah,
Jeff. He
hello,
actually
Jeff.
said, sorry, he actually said, oh, it's it's 58 years today since Mike's first win. You got to bring that up. I thought I won't have to, but no, that's
But can you imagine how I felt?
oh
I'd done 3 races. I got 3 little trophies on this little shelf I put up in my bedroom, and I was just having the time of my life. And I wouldn't do anything that cost money because everything I earned went to try and do another motor race. Luckily, the Dunlop R7s. I had the same 4 tires for all 7 races, and it was such a light car. I didn't really need to. It had drum brakes, and they lasted, so it didn't cost. It was just the fuel, and gosh, the entry fees, they were nearly 10 shillings a time. They were really expensive.
which is well, it's expensive enough at the time, isn't it? It's that's fantastic. I just love that the fact that you did it because you loved it first and
Yeah,
foremost. Which bringing it up to the present day. There's pressure right from day one, isn't there? You think how much do these guys really truly enjoy it? Yeah, they obviously do, but there's always pressure from someone who's helped out or done something. But it was great that you did it off your own back with help from the bank, and you did it because you loved it, which is for
yeah,
the very best of reasons, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely.
Which is fantastic. I mean, just to sort of go on from there? I mean, obviously, it's a heck of a start. You must have thought, "Ah, this is easy." No, no. I don't. But when did you start to think I can really go somewhere with this? Because obviously, after 3 races, you probably can't make that call because you're on a hand-to-mouth existence. But when did you start thinking I could? I think I could really make something out of this.
It was quite a long time because I did those 7 races, and luckily and very kindly, the 750 Motor Club gave me the Mike Air Trophy for the best newcomer to motorsport in '65, which was very nice of them.
Wow.
So my father and I prepared the car for 1966, which was really just, we got a new set of tyres and polished it. I went to Brands Hatch, and I was trying to get the lead off a man called Pete Lokeman in a beautiful little Regio sports car, 1172 car, and he spun in front of me, and I thought, I have the lead now. And as he spun, I thought that he would spin to the infield.
Right.
So I just stayed flat and went past him, but he just held the slide and came backwards. So he pushed me onto the grass. And as far as I'm aware, there was a rule that stated that the earth banks on the left, on the side of the circuit, had to be 6 feet high to protect the spectators. Now, from the track to the top of the spectator bank appeared to only be about 3 feet, so they dug a ditch. So the bottom of the ditch to the top of the bank was 6 feet. I went off on the grass to miss Peter. I didn't want to T-bone him, so I just went to the left, and I got dragged down into the ditch with the wet grass. I couldn't, and it hit. The car then, of course, no seatbelts. So I smacked my face into the dashboard, which luckily turned the ignition off, turned the fuel pumps off. As then the car inverted, I sort of fell out. The car came down. It snapped my pelvis in half. It broke my arms, all my ribs, and I woke up a week later in Dartford Hospital with a written off car, sadly.
Goodness me, I mean, as I said, I've done my research, but there's only so much I can find out. But I had no idea. Goodness me, this was 66.
Yeah, first race is 66. So it was amazing. I was obviously in traction a long time with this snapped pelvis and all the other injuries. I was in there a few months. The camaraderie in motor racing is wonderful, and that is still true today. I do have issues with current motor racing, which maybe we can talk about later. I don't know, but the 750 Motor Club guys, there was a guy called Tiny Littler who eventually he bought John Love's 2-litre Cooper Formula One car, and he used to do Formula Libre races with it. But he had a body shop in southeast London, and he took the car and he repaired the chassis for us. And my father, bless his heart, used to put the chassis onto a trailer, and he would drive it to West Hill Hospital in Dartford. And he parked in a particular, I was on the first floor, a particular area in the car park. I could actually see the rebuild as it was sort of how it was going. So every week or two he would drive it, because all I wanted to do was get back in the car,
of course,
stupidly. So we did repair it, and I did carry on racing eventually, even with my arms in plaster and so on and so forth. But eventually, sadly, I had to sell it to pay off all the debts that had accrued. So that's the only racing car I've ever owned.
Wow. And that, I mean, I just love the thought of looking out the window and seeing, oh, they've done a bit more on the car. That's got in, that's in place, that's been repaired. That's fantastic.
It's wonderful. And it kept my hopes alive that I could actually get and drive again.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you say it's still, you know, it still exists today. I mean, just we had the example. What was it? Just over a week ago, was it? At the Indy 500, the English racer Stefan Wilson, he crashed and broke a vertebra, and pretty much every driver went to see him in hospital in the next couple of days. Which, you know, I guess.
One of my incidents during my career, I was in hospital with some leg injuries, and Rick Mears wrote to me
Oh, I
to
love
give
Rick.
me. Yeah, he's a great guy.
Yeah, I've always said that I'd love to get him on here because he's the winner of the first Indy 500 that I ever watched.
He's the top man, top man.
Yeah.
Anyway, he wrote to me. How he knew, how he found out, I don't know, but I had similar leg injuries to the injuries Rick had from an Indy 500 crash, and he just wrote me a letter to sympathise, which I thought was wonderful.
Wow, that must have been amazing to receive that.
Oh, it's a great community, really.
Yeah, fantastic, and it mainly still is today.
Yeah,
we've got to caveat it with mainly. We'll come to that later, I'm sure. I mean, after all that, you've got yourself back racing. I mean, how did you get yourself back into racing, and how did you eventually sort of make the step up to, was it F3, F5000, that kind of a?
Yeah, it was basically by begging. I left the checkered flag. I wanted to be involved in motor racing 7 days a week. So I joined the Firestone Tire Rubber Company, which was in Brentford, very close to Chiswick. And I had no experience whatsoever, but they took me on as an operations manager for the European race tire division. And I was responsible for the production of race tires for Grand Prix, for sports car races, and so on. And I sort of became a part-time tire engineer because if they were short at Le Mans in the late 60s, early 70s, I would go to Le Mans and do tire temperatures for Ferrari or Lotus or whoever who were running Firestone tires. So I learned a lot, but the main thing was I was meeting people. And one of the people I met was John Cavell, who you mentioned earlier. Now, I was going around scrounging. Eventually, I managed to scrounge, and I can't remember how it came about, but there was a motor company in Dulwich in South London who were running some Formula 4 cars, which were single-seaters with Hillman imp engines, which were basically small. They were Coventry Climax engines, basically, but Hillman imp engines. And they had 3 cars. The 2 owners of the company, Bob Jarvis and Pat Longhurst, were driving 2, and they had a spare car. And it came about that they lent me the car for a year with a trailer. And so I started Formula 4 racing. To cut a long story short, I was quite successful in the car. I won a lot of races, and I was very much getting the taste that I always wanted to win motor races. We went to Ingliston in Scotland for a race, and Bob Jarvis was very quick in his car, and it was raining, and for some reason, and I suppose this was the first time I ever realised that I was quite quick in the wet. Bob was leading, and you got prize money, and I towed the car all the way to Scotland. Had to stay somewhere until, so I was financially ruined that weekend. And I thought I need to win because that would cover my fuel and my hotels and I could get home. So Bob's leading. We come into the last right-hander at Ingliston, and it never even occurred to me. And I'm not a dirty racing driver, but I just happened to touch him slightly, which just put him in a little slide that allowed me to nip through and win the race and get the money. Totally forgetting that he owned the car that I was driving. So in the paddock afterwards, I lost my drive. We want the car back, thank you very much. And so that was the end of that. So that wasn't the best overtaking maneuver I'd ever really carried out. But hey, And this is where John Cavill comes in. He very kindly, we'd met, and we became good friends. And I was used to, John would ask me questions about how I took particular corners or whatever, and to try and help him along. If John's watching this, I apologize for telling this story.
He'll
We
be
were at
fine.
Mallory Park, and Gerrard's is a long, long, long right-hand corner after the start line at Mallory Park.
Yeah.
John came out. I was on pole position, and John was a little bit further back on the grid, and he was asking me whereabouts I braked and changed down for Gerrard's. Well, in a Formula 4 with this little Hillman imp engine, I was flat all the way from the hairpin back to the hairpin. You just change that, put it in top, and then stay flat all the way around through the S's and back. I don't think John could quite believe that it was flat, but hopefully it gave him some confidence that he could go faster. But we became such good friends that eventually, when I lost my drive, John let me race his car in some races, which was very kind of him and his father, Jack. And that started a huge ball rolling towards Formula 3. John very kindly sort of stepped back and said to his father, why don't we help Mike? I think Jack was going to buy John a Formula 3 car. And John basically spoke to Jack, and they very kindly wanted to put me in the car.
Wow. That's very
But
gracious.
in between that, there's a man called Sheridan Finn, who was Nigel Mansell's manager, and also sponsorship coordinator for Williams Formula 1. And in Formula 4 was happening in 1970. In 1971, Sheridan had a Formula Ford called a Titan Mark IV, made by Charlie Lucas. And Sherry, I think, was quite impressed with the way I was going in some races, and he lent me the car for a year of Formula Ford racing, and I did the European Formula Ford Championship. I didn't have any money, so I went to the PR department at Firestone and said, do you think Firestone would sponsor me in the Formula Ford? And they said, no. So I said, okay, well, I've got the car, but I don't have any running costs. And they said, well, sorry, Firestone can't help. So I went back to work, and I didn't really think about it too much. I thought, well, that's, I'll have to give the car back to Sheridan. And then I had a phone call from Firestone's PR department saying, we've got an idea. And I said, really? They said, yeah, we buy loads and loads of Firestone jackets, Firestone racing overalls for drivers at Indy and Europe, for Ferrari and Lotus. They've all got Firestone overalls. We're just about to put a big order in. The company that makes all these is called Skyjump. So we've just spoken to them and said, yes, we'll give you this order for X tens of thousands of pounds worth of clothing if you sponsor this car. I never spoke to them, I never saw them, but they gave me enough money to run the car for the year, and I never heard, they never came to the races or anything. So I ran Team Skyjump on the car all year, and that got me a year of Formula Ford 1600. Before John, very kindly, his father bought a Formula 3 March. It was the ex-James Hunt's Rose Bearings March 713S.
Right.
And
No,
I did a race at Thruxton. The first one I think was Thruxton. I think I came third in my first Formula 3 race at Thruxton in that car.
Wow.
So
I had no idea it was the James Hunt one. Obviously, I'm quite a fan of James Hunt, but yeah, oh, wow, that's very cool. And obviously, just to sort of bring all that together, I mean, you've also got podiums in your first 3 races, podium finishes. You've got injured, you've come back, you can still do it. You've still got the desire to do it. You've got good people on board, and you've gone out in a Formula 3 race and got another podium. I mean, you must have thought, with all that had gone on by this point, you must have thought, I can do this. I can really, I am good enough to do this.
Yeah, I don't think I ever thought that way. I don't think that way now. There's always somebody better. I knew I was competitive. I think it was the word competitive. I think, yes, I'm competitive. But Jack then sold the March 713 and bought a brand new Ensign from Mo Nunn. But we didn't have the money to run that. Jack, I think, paid for the race at Thruxton in the March. So it fell to me to try and get the running costs for the Formula 3 season for 1972. This was the end of 1971. So I set about, I was still begging for drives in things. And I met a man called Jeremy Sumner who had a Chevron B8. And it was such a pretty GT car. And I'd never raced anything like that with a 2-litre BMW engine. He kept saying no. And eventually I ground him down. And he said, well, I'm doing a race at Brands Hatch in a GT race. There is a Formula Libre race. You can do the Formula Libre race in my Chevron. He said, it would be a pointless exercise because Formula Libre is all single seaters. It'll be Formula 2s, Formula 3s, and so on. You'll be the only GT car. But it rained, and it was the Royal Tunbridge Wells Trophy. I qualified fairly well down because of single seaters were at the front. Anyway, I won the race in the Chevron and beat all the single seaters. And Jeremy Sumner says, my God, I've got to help you. You obviously do have a talent. And we had a meeting with some of his business colleagues in the Hilton in London. They owned a company called Dempster Developments, and they wanted to start a racing team. And it was ideal because John and Jack had the Formula 3 car. They built a little transporter. It was a transit van, and they bought the chassis and built a lovely little transporter body on the back. So I had everything apart from the rain costs. And I met with a man called Sidney Pierce, and isn't it terrible, I'm getting old, Colin Phillips. We sat in Trader Vic's at the bottom of the Hilton, and there were 3 Formula 3 championships, would you believe, at the time. There were 2 British championships. One was called the Forward Trust Formula 3 Championship. The other was the Lombard North Central Formula 3 Championship. And the European Championship was the John Player European Championship. We were going to do all 3, which was hundreds of races, which would have been wonderful for me because of the amount of time you get in race cars, because there were so many Formula 3 cars at that time. You had to have heats and finals, so you had to qualify in practice to get into a heat, and then you had to qualify in the heat to get into the final. So it's so competitive. It's wonderful. Anyway, we spoke about budgets, and it was £35,000 in 1972 to do a season. I would think in today's money it's £500,000 or so.
Wow.
But I put it over really well. They said, okay, we're just going to go and have a talk about this. And the 2 of them went and had a talk about it. And they came back and said, okay, we'll do this. But you'll have to leave your job at Firestone, because if we're going to put this and we're doing 3 championships, you have to concentrate 100% on racing. Well, by this time I got married to Chrissy, and we wanted children, and we needed to get a mortgage, and so it was quite a step to leave a really good job at Firestone, and become a professional racing driver.
It's a gamble, isn't it?
Yeah. And she was wonderful. She just said, "Yep, absolutely, you must go for it." So I made the phone call, and suddenly I gave my notice to Firestone, and I was a professional racing driver. And we did 3 Formula 3 championships. I think I came 3rd in one of the British ones, and I finished 6th in European Championship. But I did win a few races, and I was still competitive against the Alan Joneses, who became Formula One world champion in 1980, and Jacques Lafitte, and so many really good drivers in Formula 3 at the time. Tony Bryan, Ian Taylor.
Well, there was, when I was doing some research into this, I actually found when it was up a race at where was it, up at Rougheth, and the lineup for the race, there was you, but also in that race there was James Hunt, Jochen Mass, David Purley, Tom Price, Alan Jones, Tony Bryce, Ricky Von Opel, and those, I mean, crikey, that was quite a field of talent that was in that series, and obviously you were up there.
Yeah, it was great. I think
punching
I
your
don't
weight.
think I ever raced it. I think I raced at Croft rather than Rougheth, but I remember I did win that race, and I set fastest lap, which was a lap record at the time. And I'll tell you why I got fastest lap. I had such motivation to win that race. We were at Alton Park racing the day before, and I was really, really good friends with Ian Taylor, who sadly got killed at Spa in a saloon car race. But he was very, very quick in a March 733, and he had an engine failure at Alton Park, and he was going to race at Croft, but he hadn't got a spare engine. So here's the camaraderie again. You know, we lent him our spare engine so that he could come and race at Croft. Now, Ian, during the race, was giving me a hard time, and at some stage was leading me with my own engine. So there was no bigger motivation than to beat him in that race. So I did win it, and luckily beat my own engine, which was great.
Yeah, this is good. Yeah, to like lose to yourself is like, oh, it would have, would have hurt the brain a bit, that one. I saw that you did, you did some races out in France and in Italy in F3. I guess was it the kind of part of the international championship, and it was just an opportunity to go and maybe sort of experience like a different style of racing, perhaps, or a different kind of circuit? Was that part of it?
Yeah, it's all the building of the experience, because by this time I thought I wanted to drive in Formula One. It was now the big ambition was to try and be a Grand Prix driver. So I did 2 years in Formula 3, thanks to John and Jack Cavell and Dempster Developments. So my big ambition was to get to Formula One. I needed to do Formula 2, because Formula 2 Grand Prix drivers were competing in Formula 2 at the time.
Yes.
So it was so competitive, and I really felt that's where I needed to go and try and compete with the best in the world, to race against Francois Sever and all these wonderful, talented racing drivers who were in Formula One but were racing in Formula 2 at the same time.
Because obviously previously you'd had Jochen Rindt and Jim Clark had done F1 and F2 simultaneously, and
and I wanted to go that route. Sadly, Dempster wanted to race more in the UK than in Europe, and there were only 2 races in the UK for Formula 2, which was, I think, Thruxton and Crystal Palace. So it was decided that they would go the Formula 5000 route. Right. Not what I wanted to do, but at least it was a progression. And Formula 5000 had lots of power, used the same tyres as Formula 1. So I thought, well, at least it will be good experience for Formula 1. They're heavier cars, so there's a lot more weight management going on. But you still had 500 brake horsepower in a single seater. The quickest car at the time was a Lola, and I wanted a T332 to be competitive. Brian Redman had one, David Hobbs had them, The Chevron B24s were quick with Peter Gethin and Teddy Pillette. But Max Mosley spoke to the boss, Colin Phillips at Dempster Developments, and convinced him that Dempster should buy a 1974 new Formula One 741 March, and Colin Bennett, our mechanic, bless his heart, who's not very well at the moment, so I really do hope he gets better soon.
Yeah.
He put a Chevrolet engine in the back of this Formula One car, and we went testing with it. It wasn't, in my view, as good as the other cars, but I finished second in my first 5,000 race to Peter Gethin. Brian Redman was third, and it was a brilliant start for me. I went to the second race and I finished second to David Hobbs and beat everybody else. So it was going, suddenly I was leading the European Formula 5000 Championship and loving every second of it. I loved having this amount of power available to slide the car and drive it on the throttle. Again, it was all good experience, I thought, towards Formula One. It was all going really well. I was fourth at a race in Zolder, and we went to Thruxton. Now, after the previous Formula 5000 race, Max Mosley called me. It was in May 1974, and at Monaco, Hans Stuck, who was their works driver, had an accident and broke his wrist. So they phoned me. Funny enough, I was at a friend's house called Mick Hill, who used to race special saloons for the weekend. And anyway, Max found me, phoned, said, would I drive for them in the Swedish Grand Prix the weekend after in 2 weeks' time. So it was my first offer of a Formula One drive. I was over the moon. I couldn't believe it. Yeah. So the following weekend, I went to Thruxton in the 5,000, and I was going pretty well. And I came up to lap a man called Tony Dean, who was racing a Chevron, and it's really quick at Thruxton. I have no idea what speed I was doing up towards chicane. Would have been around 170, 180 miles an hour. I pulled out and went past him, but for some reason, Tony just drifted to the right slightly, and his front right hit my left rear, and it put me into a series of spins. And stupidly, I didn't let go of the steering wheel quick enough, and when it hit the barriers, it snapped my left wrist. So Riley Wiesel drove the Works March in Sweden instead of me, which was a shame. So anyway, I was doing really well in the 5,000 championship, but now I had a broken wrist and I couldn't drive. So I did do, I think, one or two more races. I raced at Monza and another race, and then I got a call. Dempster got a call from Mo Nunn. Vern Schuppen had left their team. Teddy Yip was sponsoring him in the MN01, very, very basic Ensign Formula One car.
Yeah.
And a deal was done that I would drive the car for the rest of the season, starting in starting in Italy. So I went to the Italian Grand Prix with the Ensign and didn't qualify, sadly. I then went to Austria and didn't qualify, and it was heartbreaking. There were two factors really. Bernie Eccleston wasn't very kind to us. We couldn't have qualifying tyres, which when you had 30 people trying to get in for 25 places on the grid, you needed all the help you could get.
Sure.
So to try and qualify on race tyres was very difficult. Yeah. And the Ensign, every time I turned the car left, it lost fuel pressure. So the engine went a bit flat until it came out of the corner and then it picked up again. So I was just fighting a losing battle.
Yeah.
We went to Canada and the same thing again. It was just horrendous.
Yeah.
So much so that when we arrived at Watkins Glen for the American Grand Prix in October 1974, I remember sitting in the pit lane and I was looking down towards the first corner just before you go up through the S's where poor Sever was tragically killed the year before.
Yeah.
It's a flat out corner, absolutely sensational. I do love Watkins Glen.
Yeah.
And I was looking at the grandstands saying, I think that's where I'll watch the race from. And I suddenly realized what mindset I was in.
You'd almost dismiss the fact that you weren't going to race, and
yeah.
Wow.
So we'd saved one set of race tires because they were always quickest when they were new, the race tires, nowhere near as quick as a qualifying tire, but they were their fastest when they were new. So Mo had just bolted on a new set of race tires, which was the last set that we could have. And it just so fired me up. Mo had very kindly rejigged the fuel system before, after Canada and before Watkins Glen. And I didn't have this fuel surge problem. Right. So it was so much better for me. So I went out, scrubbed the tires for one lap, and I just set off on a lap. And it was going to be the lap of my life. Coming out of the first corner and up through the flat out section, I looked in the mirror and Jody Scheckter was behind me in the Tyrrell. Now, I'd raced against Jody in Formula Ford in 1971, and we'd bang wheels, and I knew how aggressive he was and so on. I don't know if Jody would ever watch this podcast, but
well, I am trying to make contact with him. I'm trying my best. Down at Laverstoke Farm, I'm trying.
Well,
but
don't tell him this. Don't remind him of this story.
I'll just mute this
bit. He was just behind me. Obviously, he was in a quicker car. He was probably a quicker driver, but I just couldn't let him by. This was the best chance. These tires on the next lap would be a few tenths slower, which would make all the difference. Yeah. So I kept looking in my mirrors, and there's Jody. Now, we called Jody a nickname. Now, whether he ever knew about it, I don't know. But there was a book at the time, I can't remember who wrote it, but it was called Jonathan Livingston's Seagull. And it was a book about a colony of seagulls and all their different characters. And there was a really aggressive seagull, and his name was Fletcher. So if ever we wanted to ask somebody, one of the other drivers, if they'd seen Jody, you'd always say, have you seen Fletcher anywhere? And so we just called him Fletcher. And because he was always so aggressive. So anyway, all around this lap, I'm doing my utmost with this poor old ensign that hadn't qualified for a while. And I finished the lap, and Jody was still 2 inches from the back of my car. So we get back, and I look, and I qualified 22nd out of 30. So I qualified for the race. Can you imagine how I felt? It was
that feeling. Must have been
delighted. It was just the achievement of my ambition. I was going to do a Grand Prix.
Must have been incredible.
So I went to have a shower, got changed, and as I came out, Ken Tyrrell came up to me and said, "Oh, Mike, Jody's looking for you." And I thought, "Oh, I know."
Is he?
Well, I've qualified for this race, and I'm not going to take any bull from anybody. I deserve to be in this race. You know, I was quicker than Stuck. I was quicker than Tim Schenkin. I was quicker than Brambilla. And why shouldn't I be in this race? So I go down to Jody. He's talking to somebody, and it's building up inside me. I'm not going to take any bull. So when the guy departs, I go up to him, and with my finger, I plant it in Jodie's chest. Are you looking for me? he just looked aghast, and he said, "Well," he said, I just wanted to tell you how well you were making that shit ensign go." And I felt about that big, you know. It was the biggest compliment I'd ever had in motor racing.
Wow.
And
Wow.
the other thing was, I had a hero at the time. I mean, a big hero. I thought Ronnie Peterson was just the best in his Lotus 72, and he was driving Lotus 72 chassis number 6, and I was I think 2/10 slower than Ronnie.
Wow.
And I was next to him on the grid. Can you imagine how I felt sitting on that grid that day, looking at Ronnie Peterson?
I'm
And
trying to imagine, but
it was incredible. Going round the parade lap before the race, I was behind Denny Hulme. Denny Hulme was in the car in front. Well, Denny was a hero in the States with Can-Am and so on and so forth.
Yeah, with
And
McLaren
they were cheering Denny, and then I would go by and they'd say, "Who the hell are you?" It was an amazing experience.
Yeah, I'm sure. I can't imagine how that must feel. I mean, you know, and at Watkins Glen as well. Oh, wow. Obviously, there was an event in that race, which was not terribly nice, which we're going to come to shortly. But how did the race sort of go for you? Your own race. I mean, do you have sort of memories of it? I mean, I'm sure there's bits that stick in there.
I do. It it was horrendous. We'd had this fuel problem with the fuel surge wherever it was, and Mo had cured it. So I'd go out on the warm-up lap. Now, the first reserve was Tim Schenken in another works Lotus 72, JPS Lotus 72. And halfway round the lap, I lost fuel pressure. It has to run normally way up in, I can't remember, 80 or 100 PSI. And it came down to 40. And the engine wouldn't rev. So I got to the start line, and I'm trying to switching pumps off and on and try and get the engine to run. Anyway, the guy starts the race, and I'm going nowhere. Everybody goes, and if I crack the throttle slightly, the engine would run. And so I knew I had to get back to the pit lane because I didn't want to retire. So I drove it all around the circuit at about 25 miles an hour on just over tick over. And I got lapped 3 or 4 times before I got back to the pit lane. And they let Schenken out as first reserve. What it was, the actual Cosworth V8, the DFV, had a pressure relief valve in the engine. It wasn't anything to do with Mo's fuel system. This time, the engine pressure relief valve, fuel injection pressure relief valve had gone. So, of course, Mo didn't have one. So he's running around the paddock trying to find one. So I lost, I think, 8 or 9 laps while they put a new one on, and they found it. And so I wasn't going to be classified. He said, "Well, just go out." And so I went out, and I had to drag Schenken off, which he was very annoyed about. But when I did go out, I hooked up with Chris Amon, who was driving the BRM P201. And we had a wonderful time, even though I was 9 laps behind, because Chris was running about 9th or 10th. And we just overtook each other, and we had a nice time until the end of the race. So it was a good experience to do an hour or more around the Glen and dice with a legend like Chris Amon. Wow. And that, because I'd gone out and diced with Chris, I didn't have a drive for 1975. And dicing with him brought me to the attention of Louis Stanley, which was another story to be told.
No, gosh, and we'll come to that a bit. I mean, it's something I sort of, because I wasn't around at the time, This is like the era that I'm most sort of fascinated in. But fortunately, it was an era that had had very much a dark side. You mentioned about Francois Server and many others. I mean, that race, unfortunately, we lost Helmut Koenig, and
Yep.
just horrific accident. I mean, I don't like talking about this. I don't want to dwell on it for too long. But I mean, were you on track at the time of the accident, or were you having
Yeah,
the issues in the pits?
I was.
And
It's a little bit worse than that for me because he and I had raced against each other in the European Formula Ford Championship. So we'd become friends. And so much so that as we left to go to the Glen, my wife was in hospital with a problem with the pregnancy of our first child. So to be honest, I wasn't really that keen on going to work in America
sure,
for that week. But Helmut came with me to see my wife and say, I hope everything's all right, and so on. And we traveled out to America together. So I saw he'd had an accident, but I couldn't see the consequences of it.
right,
So it wasn't until I got out of the car at the end that they told me that sadly he'd lost his life.
yeah, good. I think it's again from what we sort of heard and with constructions, it's probably best that you don't see what happened because it sounds like it was really horrendous and unfortunately it was part of it. But yeah, very sad to have lost anyone, of course, but certainly in that manner, not nice at all. But moving on to other things, you mentioned about BRM, which is obviously where you ended up briefly the following year. And you raced on two absolutely fantastic circuits. But how did it all come about? Obviously, you were in their. I guess you were on their radar after what came.
Well, yeah, I think it was only because I was running around having fun with Chris at the Glen. I was very friendly with Mike Howard. I first met him in when my brother was racing motorcycles. Mike arrived at Brands Hatch one day when we were there in a brand new E-Type Jaguar, and I'd never seen him. He looked like a spaceship. So Mike said he'd give me a ride in it. So I had a ride in an E-Type, and I vowed I'd own an E-Type Jaguar from that day. But we got on so well that Mike recommended to John Surtees that I'd make a good test driver. And so I started to do a bit of testing for Big John in Formula One cars at Goodwood and so on. That was scary in itself. And he told me that he would like me to have a race drive, but he had no money, but he had French drivers who would come with money. There was one day when I was doing some testing and one of the French drivers arrived that eventually drove for the team. And I was 2 seconds lap quicker than him on the day, but he still got the drive because he had the money. So Formula One was changing. It wasn't a sport anymore. It was getting more business-like.
Financial side, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I then was contacted by Louis Stanley, who'd taken over the BRM team, saying that he didn't know me, but he'd seen me dicing with Chris, and would I be interested in talking to him about a drive for 1975? So I went to the Dorchester. He had a suite in the Dorchester, 24/7, 365 days a year, whether he was there or not.
Very nice too.
Yeah, well, I think it was probably the Owen family money that was paying for it. So I had some unbelievably difficult meetings with him. The upshot was that yes, he wanted me to drive, but no, he wouldn't pay me. And I said, well, I have a wife and who's pregnant and a mortgage. I need to earn some money. He said, well, you can have the drive, but all you'll get is a signing contract fee of £5 or something. And bless their hearts, I started begging again, and Dempster's agreed to pay me a salary while I drove for BRM, which was very nice of them.
Wow.
so I could accept the drive.
Yeah, and just kept things ticking over and kept you in a seat.
Yeah, so he said, well, you need to test the car. So I said, fine. And it was arranged I would go to Snetterton, which was really quite wonderful because I'd done my first ever race at Snetterton, and I'd watched some really fast cars going around there, which were a lot faster than my little DRW. And then to go there testing to drive Formula One was an amazing experience.
Okay.
So Chris Amon was there as well, and they put me in a P160 first while Chris was testing the P201. And probably it was Tony Southgate design car. I'm friendly with Tony, and I still say to him to this day, it was probably one of the best single-seater chassis I ever drove. It's wonderful. So I drove that in the morning, and the engine after the Cosworth seemed to lack 100 horsepower.
Right.
It just didn't seem to pull at all. The engine was 4 years old by this time, and Chris had to leave at lunchtime, so I was put in the P201 in the afternoon, and I drove that. Again, a sensational chassis, but the engine just didn't seem to pull. So we were leaving January the 7th, my birthday in 1975, to go to Argentina for the first Grand Prix. At Snetterton, after I'd done about 10 or 12 laps, it put a rod out through the side, and so that put paid to the test. And when I got to Argentina and I looked at the car, I always have a good look around what I'm going to race. It was the same engine that I blew up at Snetterton with the block welded, and so I wasn't 100% confident that we were going to do very well,
right,
reliability wise. And I did. I drove my heart out around Argentina. I qualified 22nd, which was right near the back, and the engine failed in the race, which was I expected it really.
Yeah.
We then went to Brazil, and the same thing. The engine was really, really down on power, and again, I didn't finish the race in Brazil.
Yeah.
So when I got back, Mr. Stanley was very unimpressed with my driving, and I said, "Well, I'm really sorry, but the car just is not in any way competitive."
Yeah, it's like you're doing the best with what you had, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I got some lovely photographs of me trying so hard in the car with it twisting and bucking, and it reminds me of how I saw Ronnie drive the Lotus 72. I was trying to get everything out of the car, and I said that I felt just to get some reliability and another 100 horsepower, we should put a DFV in the back of the P201 and just test it and see how we go. And he fired me on the spot. He said that he would never put an American engine in the back of a BRM. And wow. I said, well, hang on a minute. This is a Cosworth made in Northampton by Mike Costin and Keith Duckworth. It's as British as you can get. And it didn't occur to me at the time to say, well, you put an American V8 in the back of a P154 Can-Am BRM.
Yeah.
I didn't think to say that. He said it's the DFE Cosworth is sponsored by Ford, therefore it's American. And so sadly, that was the end of my association with BRM, which is a shame. And I have to say, the Owen family have been really nice to me. Mr. Louis Stanley has a bit of a reputation, and they let me drive a P160 at Shelsley Walsh last year, and I'm giving a talk for BRM at their BRM association gathering in a few months' time, and they're so nice to me. And I had such a bad time there, but I'm still proud to have driven a BRM and a couple of Grand Prix.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on the subject of the engine, I sort of touched on this before we started. I've actually got the Cosworth engine on my t-shirt. I feel kind of bad about it, but whoops, my bad. But just very quickly, even though you were, I'm a circuit sort of nerd. I love all the circuits, the old ones, and what I call the proper layout and stuff. I mean, even though you were down on power in both Argentina and Brazil, the old Argentina circuit looks absolutely fantastic. John Watson said it was one of his favorites, but also what I call the proper Interlagos layout, the big long one.
Yeah, it was
what were they like to drive, even down on power?
It was incredible. There's one corner, I can't remember the Argentinian name for it, but it was a little bit like Gerard's at Mallory Park, but it was flat in a Formula One car. It wasn't for me initially. It took me a long time. Now, John, funnily enough, was very, very kind for me. He walked me around Watkins Glen because I'd never driven any of these circuits. And he was very, very helpful to me. So when he told me something was flat, I knew he wasn't giving me any bull. It was flat, and that first happened at Watkins Glen up through the S's, and eventually I did do it flat, and it was scary, but it had to be done to get a lap time. So I couldn't do it straight away. I had to build up to it. It took me at least one practice session before I got anywhere near flat. And it was the same at Argentina. This long right-hand corner was sensational. And it was out in the farmland, way away from the stadium section. And I had a really scary moment because you do that flat in top gear. You go down another straight towards another right-hander. And I was mindful as all this was happening of poor Jochen Rindt's crash at Monza, where he had inboard brakes on the Lotus 72 and drive shaft broke on one side, a UJ broke. Well, I had that happen on the P201. I was doing 180 miles an hour, bang the brakes on, and one of the UJs broke and it just turned left. But it turned left so violently, it just spun down the road and dissipated all the speed, and I didn't have an accident, thank God. Wow. Very, very, very lucky.
Wow.
But it was not a very nice experience. But the circuit itself, sensational, as was Interlagos. The old Interlagos was.
It was about 5 miles long, wasn't it? So it was a huge circuit.
It was, and again, it was wonderful. Such challenging corners. As a racing driver, I love quick corners. Now, the corner past the start and finish line at Interlagos, where now they turn left into a chicane, right, and then left, and join a straight again. Well, that was a flat out top gear, left-hand corner going downhill. Every time you get, it's like a Rouge at Spa. Every time you come down to it, it gives you a buzz. You know, this is something very special.
You kind of feel yourself smiling, I guess. You're just like, here we go, type thing.
Yeah, it's incredible. But the night thing, I was having a dice while the car lasted. I was having a dice with Wilson Fittipaldi in their new Copasu car that they'd made with a Cosworth engine in. And every time we came out of that flat out downhill left-hander, the fence line all the way down to the next left-hand corner, when I was in front of them, all I could see were fists through the fence at me. And then if Wilson overtook me going down, all I could see was everybody was cheering. And then as soon as I overtook him again, all I got was fists. It was really quite amusing. But yeah,
love it.
at the time, they were possibly two of the best circuits I'd ever driven.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, just from seeing limited footage and the layout and imagining it, it must have been absolutely fantastic, absolutely superb. I mean, just on a side note, I mean, obviously the winner of that, of that race in Brazil was like Carlos Pache. He was his only ever win, and he was obviously very sadly last. He was Watson's teammate.
Yeah.
Spoke about him last week. It's but what a place to get his first win, just as a little sidestep. I mean, at home in front of that crowd.
Yeah, he was taken too early again, sadly.
Yeah, very sad, and off track as well, as we know.
Yeah.
But so obviously, yeah, unfortunately, just the two drives for BRM. But you had a one-off drive with like Shadow. Now, or in the Shadow, was that alongside the Shell Sports series that you'd kind of gone to, or did it kind of tie in? I'm assuming here, so.
That was, yes, the year after the BR. I didn't really do anything again in 1975 after those two Grand Prix. But I was contacted by Roger Springett, who, funnily enough, had gone into the Shadow factory to try and buy a rev counter for his racing Hillman Imp.
Right.
And he saw these, I think it was like three. There was a DN1 and two DN3s just sitting there, and he just asked the question, "Are you racing those?" And they said, "No, we're trying to sell them at the moment." And Roger, instead of coming out with a rev counter, came out with 3 Formula One cars. He bought them
as you do.
as you do. As you do.
We've all been there.
And I don't know who introduced my name to him, but he contacted me, and he was going to run Lella Lombardi in the cars, and I'm not sure if it was a funding issue, or I think John Webb of Brands Hatch was wanting to put her in the car, but anyway, it didn't happen. So her name was on the car, and I went off to Thruxton for my first race in it in the pouring rain with her name on the car. And Roger and I got on famously, so I drove for him throughout 1976 in that car. Sadly, we had an accident at Mallory Park. I was overtaking a man called Bill Gugelman, who had a Formula 2 March, and similar thing. Somehow, as I went past, we touched, and I wrote the car off on the bank down at the S's at Mallory Park. So we had to use the other car. We'd already entered as a wild card for the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch. And so we had to build that car up, and it never turned a wheel until we got to Brands that very day.
Really?
So really our back was to the wall. You try and come into a Formula One race with a car that you've never driven.
And not run.
No. So we didn't qualify, sadly. But we gave it a good go. I drove it as hard as I could, and we just needed a test day, really. All we were doing during qualifying was testing the car to try and make it go quicker, and we ran out of time.
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, it's one of those, again, if the accident hadn't happened previously, it might have panned out differently, but we'll never know. I've just seen a comment, actually, a guy from Keith Mail. Hello, Keith. He said, just going back to when he went in to buy a rev counter and came out with 3 F1 cars, he says, my wife wouldn't be happy if I did that when I went out shopping. It's bad enough if I buy a 1:43 model scale. That is an impressive shopping trip. Yeah.
Roger, who sadly died fairly recently, was a super bloke. He was just a dynamic guy. He bought and sold cars, and a really lovely, straight as a die, wheeler dealer, and he just put deals together. He got sponsorship from 100 Plus. I think it was they were wheels run by Steve Neal, Matt Neal's father. And
Father,
funny
yeah,
enough, I still, when I see Matt sometimes, he still reminds me that in his dad's office, there's a picture of me in the shadow with 100 Plus sponsorship on his office wall.
brilliant.
So that's how it came together. There was also PR Riley that Roger was doing deals with, which was an Irish company. So it all came together. That's where the running costs came from, and bless him, he let me drive it.
Wow. Lovely, lovely. Just while my eyes are on the comment section, we've got Jim Moody's in. You said Jim was going to come in, so evening, Jim. We spoke with your friend
Jim,
Carl Jones recently, so legend in his own right, Mr. Moody. Brilliant.
oh, he's a legend, absolute
Absolutely.
legend. He and I used to fly helicopters together a lot. I have a lot of time for Mr. Moody.
Fantastic. We're going to come on to helicopters a bit later. But no, thank you for tuning in, Jim. It's fantastic to have you tuning in. I mean, the Shell Sports Series, which became sort of British F1 and stuff. I mean, for those, I mean, people may not know what it was. Can you just go into exactly how it all worked? Because it wasn't obviously full F1, was it? It was
No,
a spin-off
it was
almost.
for basically 1 or 2 year old Formula One cars. It was devised by John Webb of Brands Hatch. He was such an innovator with Formula Ford 1600, Sports 2000, Formula Ford 2000. And he came up with this idea of having a British Formula One championship, and obviously struggled to get entries. So there was a Formula 2 class, so you could run Formula 2 cars in with it. And it was, I thought it was successful. It's a shame the grids weren't bigger, but we had some really good races and some really good race drivers. I remember, I think I raced against Agostini. Giacomo Agostini raced a Williams when I raced the only Chevron Formula One car that was ever made, the B41. And I diced with Agostini for third place at Silverstone, and the bugger beat me, but it was really good fun. So I thought it was very, very good racing. We got good crowds, and it's a shame that it didn't really last that long. I didn't get a drive in jumping forward a couple of years. I drove in the Formula 2 class in that series in 1978 for a guy called Graham Eden in a Rolt RT1 with a BDG in the back, and I won the Formula 2 class that year. It reinforced how sad I was at not doing Formula 2 in 1974, because the cars are so sweet that you've got 250 brake horsepower in a really nimble, small, light chassis. And I could beat a lot of the Formula One cars at certain circuits with the Formula 2 car. So it was a shame that it all came to an end. It happens with a lot of British series. I raced a Williams in something called the British Open. That only lasted one race.
83 from my
Yeah,
research, 83.
yeah. It's the only time in a Formula One car I've got pole position, fastest lap, and won the race.
There
So
you
I'm
go.
glad it happened, even just the once.
Yeah. That's all you need.
Yeah,
Ticked.
gentlemen.
Terrific.
But it's a shame that this sort of thing happens. They're good ideas, but they don't get supported, so they don't last very long.
Yeah, and and it still happens. Even like more recently, there was that was it A1 GP with the football
Yep.
clubs and all that kind of thing. Great idea, was really good, but then it didn't. It just died on its backside, really, unfortunately, which is
Yeah.
shame.
And Formula Woman and so on. It's a
Yeah,
shame that they can't carry on.
yeah, real shame. Just a couple of cars I want to talk to that you drive. I mean, you mentioned the RT1. I mean, that the RT1 sort of, the route it came, various incarnations of it. Basically, dominated F3 in the early sort of 80s, didn't it? I mean, I spoke with like Kenny Atchison. He's got one in his workshop, and I always remember they were around. It was them and the Reynard in like the mid to late 80s, but the route cars were something else, as you've alluded to.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I they were well, they were Formula 3 cars really with a Formula 2 engine in the back.
Yeah.
So they were very light, very nimble. You could outbrake a Formula 1 car. You could your apex speed was probably quicker than the Formula 1 cars. They were a delight, absolute delight to drive. As I say, we were lucky enough to win the championship with that car. I would love to have driven more Formula 2. I drove a March, Kim Mather's March. I drove once in a race, and again, just fantastic fun to drive. If you're a racing driver, it's the sort of car you want to drive.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very well-timed comment from Christopher Carroll. Evening, Christopher. I was about to bring up one of the most like distinctive cars in my mind from the era, the Chevron B30, and Christopher's just commented on it. Firstly, what was that car like to drive? Because it had that little sort of hump at the back, and it always looked quite striking.
Yeah, it was a great car. Chevron. I always had a lot of time for Chevrons. In fact, I became a Chevron ambassador at one time with Brian Redman. But the quad cam V6 Ford was a good engine, and it suited the car. It wasn't a particularly heavy engine, but we still got over 400 horsepower out of it, I think. Sadly, I think I only raced it about 2 or 3 times. Roger Springett again bought it. It was ex-David Purley car. I think it was a one-off. David actually commissioned the car to be built, and he won quite a lot of races with it early in its life. And then Roger got hold of it. We had a lot of mechanical trouble with it, sadly. But when it was on song, it was really quick, really lovely car.
Yeah, oh, good. I'm glad to hear that because I can only go on the look of it, and so I'm glad that that it was just as nice to drive.
It was.
Christopher Carey's just mentioned says, yeah, you raced the ex David Purley Chevron, which subsequently morphed into your good friend Jeff Wilson's Donington GT Championship BMW M1. So yeah, there you go. Yeah, and he's just asking how you liked it. So perfectly timed question, Christopher. Thank you very much. Where are we? I've just kind of there's so much. I've got so many things in my notes, but I'm gonna have to roll on because But 14 grams. Yeah, so 79, 80. You just had like a couple of races. Excuse me. In the March 772 and the Chevron B41, as you said. Why was it just a couple of races? Was it just the series and the funding, or was it just a?
I couldn't get any drives. Couldn't get any drives. So again, Chrissy, we now had 2 children and a mortgage, and so I had to go to work because I couldn't earn my living out of motorsport anymore. So I became competition again. I wanted to stay within motorsport, and I became competitions manager for the British Racing and Sports Car Club for a while, and I used to be clerk of the course at race meetings, and I did that for a few years, driving what I could as and when, like the March and the Chevron. But eventually, it was lovely to be involved in motorsport again, 7 days a week. But I wanted to drive. I didn't want to be ticking off drivers in the steward's room. I wanted to actually be driving, and that's when I got a phone call from one of my best friends in the sport, Ray Mallock.
Yeah, and that obviously, and I mean, this was around the time that I guess, like for the reasons you said, it kind of shifted from the single seat and the shell sport and that kind of thing into what is now the British Touring Car Championship and sports cars and just a different style of racing. Do correct me if I'm wrong. Was it like the Saloon Car Championship as it was? Did that come around first, or was it the?
Yeah, it was. Christy and I had moved to Buckinghamshire, and I have a passion for flying. So I started to fly helicopters out of High Wycombe, which is how I met the great legend that is Jim Moody, because Jim had a helicopter and I taught him to fly it, and we had a great time flying together. So my helicoptering sort of dovetailed a little bit with the races that I could scrounge. And because I was in Buckinghamshire, I was near a place called Beaconsfield. And
I used to work there. I know it very well. Yeah.
well, Hughes at Beaconsfield were running the Works Toyotas. And I was very friendly with Wyn Percy, who was the Works Toyota driver at the time. And sometimes there was a clash when, I don't know, had to go to Australia or whatever. Because I was local, they asked me if I would stand in British touring car races in the Works Toyota for him. Funny enough, in Shelsley Walsh in July, I'm going to drive that Toyota again at the Hillclimb. The owner of it now said it would be fun if I came along and drove it. So I'm looking forward to that. So yes, but I was more of a reserve driver. I drove that car. I drove with Terry Drury in his Alfa Romeo V6 in the Tourist Trophy. I drove a Renault in the Tourist Trophy in another race another year. So I was doing bits and pieces. But prior to that, I did my first Le Mans.
Yes.
1981, which I did in the baby Porsche 935, and it's like going back to when I first started racing. I had a eureka moment. Le Mans just became for me the best ever motor race that I've ever done.
Wow.
I love the circuit. Where else could you go along a public road at 240 miles an hour? And it was just sensational. I loved it.
Obviously, this is before the chicanes and everything that have gone in. It was the proper blast.
Yes. Yeah, you sat there for 3.5 miles with your foot planted on the floor.
Wow.
It was a very unlucky race for me. The Porsche, because of its turbos and what have you, had to lift off twice on the straights to try and dissipate some of the heat, and sadly it didn't work, and we melted a piston, so I didn't finish. But it was the start of my love affair with Le Mans. I did it 7 times and sadly only finished once because of mechanical failures or accidents or whatever. It's just awesome. I can't tell you how awesome that race is. I did race there in July last year in the Classic, which is the first time I'd ever driven with that circuit with the chicanes. It's totally spoiled
it. Where's the fun in slowing down?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I can understand they're worried about tires and so on, but my God, sit there towing somebody at 240 miles an hour at night in the rain. Oh, wow. I mean, what racing driver that wouldn't love that? I mean, it's just awesome.
Totally incredible. I can actually, there was one, I've spoken to a number of people who've competed, in the great race and they've won it, I've spoken with like Jackie Hicks and with like David Brabham, Stefan Johansson, these guys who have won it, Mark Blundell, Derek Warwick, and they've all loved it apart from one, and that was Steve Soper. He hated it. He goes, no, it's dangerous. I don't like it. It's too dark. It's too wet. He wasn't a fan. Steve's a bit safer than many, I think.
And it was funny. I spoke to Keke Rosberg once, and he said he'd never do it. It's far too dangerous, he said,
Really?
which is
Well,
quite funny, really.
each to their own. Each to their own, of course.
Absolutely. Of
Well,
course,
all right. I mean,
Le Mans in the dark in July is on the front of my book.
yes. Right, you've got to get the book. Yes, go and get the book. It's a fantastic read, absolutely brilliant read. I mean, I just want to sort of go on to actually sports cars and like Le Mans just to cover it. There was one. And yeah, you said that you love, you know, that you love doing Le Mans. I mean, I think I've asked this to everyone who's raced it. I mean, do you kind of prepare differently for it, or do you just go there, take it all in, and just
Yeah,
do it, just live it?
it's another motor race. I love going to motor races. I used to train. I mean, I'm 77 now, so I don't train anymore. But at that time, I was swimming every morning. I'd swim a mile or two every morning, going to the gym and do some stamina training. We didn't have isotonic drinks and all the technical side of training we have now. I just kept myself fit. But if you're going to do a Grand Prix for 2 hours, all you're doing really when you race at Le Mans is you're doing a Grand Prix each stint, and then you
Sure.
have a rest, and then jump back in and do a Grand Prix distance again, and have a rest and do it again. So it's this, you need stamina for it, and touch wood. At the time, I kept myself fit enough that I'd lose about 10 pounds in weight, because in a Group C car, you're basically driving for 2 hours with temperatures in the cockpit are around 55 towards 60 degrees C. And they don't know they're born, these guys who race there now. They've got power steering, they change gears with paddles,
Yeah.
they have to have air conditioning in the cars. So it was hard work. You have huge tires, you have ground effect, and a very small steering wheel, and you have a gear lever. It was hard work, but just the best hard work in the world.
Yeah, what an experience. Must be absolutely amazing. Just one car I do want to touch on, one that has always kind of fascinated me. As I said, I'm a bit of a nerd about these kind of things. The car you drove in '82, that like the Cadenet Lola, it looked like a little sort of friendly little squat little sort of.
They called it the Morris Minor 1000, yeah.
Yeah. It's a similar question to the one I asked about the Chevrolet. I mean, it was a brilliant looking thing. I thought it was great, really cool looking thing. What was that like to drive? And obviously, unfortunately, it was a very sad event in the race again, but later on. But what a cracking little car!
Yeah,
it seemed to be.
it was bought by a Frenchman called Francois Duret, who was a great character, absolute character. And because I'd done Le Mans once before, he thought I should be the man who would help him at that race. The basic car was a Lola that was transferred into a Decadene, and then ADA Engineering built this strange looking little body for it for Le Mans. It was an absolute disaster, because I was the most experienced at Le Mans, having done it once before. I did the start, and I had the throttle stick open after about 2 laps. So I drove it back to the pits on the ignition switch, and they fixed the. In fact, it was probably a bit more than 2 laps, but we were doing 19 lap stints for fuel. Then we put fuel in, do another 19, then change drivers. They fixed the sticking throttle, and I said, fill it up with fuel and I'll start the stint again. because I'd only done a handful of laps. No, 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 we're going to stick to our schedule. And so said the team manager. So I went out, and we used to have pit signals down at just after Mulsanne Corner. And so I'm doing lap after lap after lap, thinking this is all good and it's going quite nicely. And I see 3 laps to go. Fine. 2 laps to go. And then whereupon the car ran out of fuel. So that was the end of the race. I don't think I've ever been so annoyed in my life. I almost hit the team manager.
Given that you called it,
they just got it so wrong.
And like you'd said, no, let's fuel it, and they said no. Yeah.
Because we knew where we stood. If we started off full up, we knew where we stood again. But hey, so that was the end of that one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, something I don't really want to dwell on too much. Obviously, we lost a driver that year, Jean-Louis Lafosse, and for anyone who's seen the footage, it's not particularly nice, and I don't recommend anyone seeing it. Just generally, I mean, obviously, we touched on what happened with Helmut Koenig, and I've asked this to a number of racing drivers in the past. When someone is lost during a race, or before a race, or anything like that, I've always been fascinated in how, in your mind, you sort of separate the fact that you've got a job to do and your job is to go and race versus the human side of someone's just died. And that kind of, I mean, do you have that battle in your mind of, do I really want to go and do this, or do I have to, or should I, or what could happen? Because when that doubt comes in, that's when you need to step back.
Yeah,
a few people have said so.
I've always thought it's never going to happen to me. It's a terrible, selfish thing to say, maybe, but if you're going to sit in a race car, I mean, Jim Moody, who hopefully is still watching this, how Jim, I used to go and watch Jim at the TT occasionally. Now people die at the TT, sadly.
Yeah. Well, we lost a few last year, didn't we, unfortunately?
Yeah. And I used to watch and think about that when I saw Jim get on his bike and go race. I used to love playing rugby when I was a young man. Now I knew every time I went on the rugby pitch, okay, I was only playing schoolboy type rugby, but when some of the boys were quite big, and when they tackled you, it hurt. But it didn't stop you wanting to go and play the game.
Yeah.
You didn't think about, if I go out there, I'm going to get hurt. You just went and played the game. I've sadly had some really nasty accidents in race cars, but I never ever thought that I have confidence in my ability. I'm not the best, and never have been the best racing driver in the world, and I make mistakes like everybody does, but the majority of my accidents have been mechanical failure, i.e. wishbone breaking or something putting the car out of my control. But I trust the people who are preparing the cars I drive. I have confidence in my ability. So if you ever have that mindset that I could get hurt if I get in that race car, you're not you're not fit for purpose, really. You're not going to be a racing driver.
Yeah. Which is, well, that's the fact of the matter. That's when you need to step back from it, because you've got that doubt. So, no, great. No, I appreciate you sort of talking about it. It's never a nice subject, but it's always one that does crop up sometimes. Just very quickly, the time you spent with Akuria Kos, the 3 or 4 runnings of Le Mans with, was it Ray Malik, and with David Leslie again, another one very sadly not with us. That was a good outfit, wasn't it? The Akuria Kos.
Oh, awesome!
crew.
Absolutely awesome. We had a ball outside of the car. We had parties. We just had the greatest time. But at the race circuit during that race weekend, so professional. I have so much admiration for the ability of Ray Mallock designing the car.
Yeah.
He's a brilliant race driver. And that telephone call he made to me at the end of 1983, he said he was going to build cars for a Cost to go back to Le Mans, and would I be involved, was just such a lifeline for me. It just
Brilliant.
it was just wonderful. And we went off to he built this car. We went off to Monza, and I honestly thought we could have won it. We came second in our first race, purely because you have a fuel. It's 1,000 k's, so it's a 6-hour race, and you have to finish the race with that fuel within that fuel allocation you've been given. And because we were all a bit excited, we were a bit naive in World Championship long distance racing. The lads forgot to weaken the mixture on the grid, where we normally warm the car up with the mechanical injection on full rich to get it started, because it's easier, because when you lean it off, the engine starts to become a little more difficult to drive slowly around to the grid or whatever. So they left it on rich, and we got halfway through the race and realized suddenly that we didn't have enough fuel to finish the race.
Right.
So we had to cut the RPM down, and we did finish, but it cost us a win, and we finished second. But what a wonderful, wonderful car Ray designed. It was a little Group C2, so we were out there with Group C1s, the Rothmans, Porsches, the Jaguars, and all the very, very quick stuff. Our first Le Mans in '84, again, because I was the most experienced, they said, well, you go out first and see what the car's like. So I set off. We did an installation lap. The guys had a look at the car. Everything was good. Okay, go. And we had a rev limit. The Cosy was probably good to 11,000 RPM, but we kept it to 9, I think, and to get reliability. And Ray had worked out the gearing with the tire growth at 200 miles an hour. So now I'd not done 200 miles an hour. I think the old Lola, the Porsche and the Lola was around 180. We were getting down the straight. And we had nowhere to test in the UK that we could get top speed. So the first time it went down Mulsanne was the first time the car had ever reached its maximum miles per hour. So I went out and I set off down, came out of Tete Rouge in third, 9,000, put it in fourth, 9,000, put it in fifth. And Ray said, when you get to 9,000, you should be doing about 200 miles an hour. So I'm sitting there and it's climbing, 8.8, 9, 9.2, 9.4, and it was just going faster. It topped out at 217 miles an hour, which for a little Group C car with 13-inch wheels was astounding. And you know, I could take my hands off the steering wheel. It was so stable. Wow. It was the most lovely, lovely car to drive. And I think in the race, before we had the problem, we were about 8 laps in the lead from the next C2 car. It was stunning. So I had 4 years in that team. It's the only world championship I ever won, 1986, when we won the team world championship. Yeah. But we changed from the Cosworth to the 6R4 V6 engine, and Swindon Racing made it into an endurance engine for us. And it was really good. It was light. Didn't have as much horsepower as the Cosworth, but we did less pit stops, which was great.
Right. I always love talking to drivers who have raced sports cars in this era, and they all just have that. Just you can tell it's like that was fantastic. What a fantastic era
Group C
for that.
was the best. Group C was better than Formula One to me,
I was,
because
yeah.
if you went to the British Grand Prix, say in 1986 or 7 or 8,
I went like,
there'd be pole position, but Group C race several weeks later, pole position would be quicker than the Formula One race,
yeah,
because we had ground effect. We could turn engines up to over 1,000 horsepower. So we were driving cars that were quicker than Formula One cars, which I think was the basis in the end why Mr. Eccleston killed it, because it was more popular. It was getting more popular with the manufacturers than Formula One, because it bore more relation to the vehicles that people were buying for the road.
yeah, it was almost upstaging it. I mean, but you just
Yeah,
talk about the drivers who went from F1 and were doing sports cars at the time. You know, there was like Martin Brundle, Derek Warwick, Eddie Cheever. Who else was? I think. Well, there was like Kenny Atchison did it. Jan Lammers went and did it. It was a lot of people were switching over to the sports car scene, and it was.
yeah, yeah,
Mauro Baldi was on there, was and all
yeah,
those kinds of guys,
yeah.
and
Oh, Bob Wallach. I mean,
yeah,
the,
so Johnny
there was
Dumfries
some.
went over and did it, and yeah,
Yeah, he co-drove with me a few times in the Ecos, which was great.
yes, of course he did, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
there were some great drivers in it, and
brilliant,
therefore there was some great motor racing going on.
yeah,
And if you look at the crowds back in those days, the grandstands were packed. It was very popular, and as I say, I think that upset Mr. Eccleston, and it was hurting Formula One.
yeah, absolutely. I said, I mean, I went to the Grand Prix qualifying in '88, and I went to the sports cars at Brands in '89. I think I spoke to Kenny about it, um, and it's still the longest it's ever taken to get out of a car park was Brands Hatch in '89 because of the crowd, the sheer volume of people that were there. It
Yeah,
was, and for I was 8 at the time, and I was just like, this is incredible. I
yeah,
remember falling asleep in the back of the car, waking up, we're still in the car park. but, but what a series!
yeah,
Absolutely fantastic. And obviously, you drove those cars around, circuits like Monza and the old Hockenheim, and I can't imagine how good that must have been. It
yeah.
must have been incredible.
The old Hockenheim was quick, was
Yeah,
very quick. Um, it's difficult to put into words just how good it was. Um, I think I drove in the World Championship for 5 years, and I wish it had been 50 years. It was just wonderful.
yeah,
So
incredible.
look forward to every race meeting. Um, that's why, I mean, I've been driving Group C for the last 2 years in classic Group C races, and when I get in the car, I've been driving Mr. Becker's Porsche 956. It was Mario Andretti's car that finished third at Le Mans in 1983.
Yeah,
The first it was 956 chassis number 101, so it was the first customer 956 that was sold to Kramer, and as I say, came third at Le Mans. When I sit in that, it makes me feel 19 again. Just
wow.
the sheer power of it, the way it pulls, those lovely turbo noises, two turbos, the wastegates, uh, the whole thing is such an amazing experience to be sitting in. The gearbox has even got synchromesh. I mean, it was Porsche built the cars to win Le Mans. They're so easy to drive, but they're so fast that to drive them very quickly is quite difficult. But to a point, they are really quite easy to drive. Um,
Amazing.
but they're just very, very special. It's the best era of motor racing for me.
So glad you said that because I think the same. I thought it was just me because I was a kid and rose tinted specs, but no,
No,
it's fantastic.
it was great. Proper motor racing in very quick cars.
Yeah, absolutely. Just very quickly before on the sport, I want to move on to some more recent stuff. But the car you got to the end of Le Mans, and the one you mentioned it earlier, the one time the time you got to finish Le Mans, the Nissan.
The
Again,
worst racing car I ever drove.
one of my favorite sports cars ever. I said I've got four. Got the Rothmans Porsche, the Silk Cut Jag, Oh, no, it's 5. Got the Golf Porsche from years ago. Kenny Atchison's Sauber C8, C9, and that Nissan. Please tell
It
me
was
it was great.
awful. It was awful. It was awful. The engine was probably one of the most powerful engines I've ever driven, because when I tested it in Japan, they asked me to go out before Le Mans and try the car, and they said, we'd like you to do some laps with the qualifying engine. So okay, that's fine. Now I thought, I've raced some pretty powerful cars. I've raced McLaren M8Fs with 900 horsepower, and but the Nissan, the Porsche, for instance, delivers its power. It's beautiful. The delivery, when the turbos come in, it's linear. It's absolutely lovely. But with the Nissan, I didn't know that at the time when I first drove it, but the boost gauge starts to move, and it doesn't. It just then goes bang. So suddenly you go from 450 brake horsepower to 1,200 horsepower, and it's instantaneous. So it's almost undrivable.
Right.
It's dreadful. So I came out of the last corner at Fuji to start a qualifying lap to see how the engine would perform. I short shift out of the chicane, which you normally do because you're pulling so much G through the corner, it's difficult to change gear. So short shift, I put my foot down, and the boost gauge, I put it in fourth, probably about 130, 140 miles an hour to go down to the 200 mile an hour straight. The boost gauge flickered, went up, and it just spun up, and I'm suddenly going backwards at 150 miles an hour, spinning onto the straight. It burst all 4 tires, damaged all 4 wheels, and they were not impressed. But I said, surely there has to be a map that would give you a little more drivability of the engine. And they never did. Even at Le Mans, we raced with, I think, to get the fuel count, we raced at 850 brake horsepower, I think. But I said, I don't want to qualify this car with this engine because it's just too dangerous.
Wow.
Because the other problem with the car, it had the worst bump steer of any car I've ever raced.
Right.
I don't know if everybody understands what bump steer is. When the front suspension goes through its geometry, for some reason, when the car hits a bump, it turns left or right.
Yeah.
It's absolutely horrendous. And with the road at Le Mans having a crown, I mean, this Nissan was doing 238 miles an hour, and you didn't know where it was going to go. So we spent all week. There was I drove it with Win Percy and an Australian called Alan Grice, who's a
Legend of
supercars,
V8s.
super V8 cars in
Holdens and
Australia. I mean, we were a great team. We all got on. It was a great team, but we all sat down after the first practice and said, do we want to drive this car? I mean, Nissan were paying us quite a lot of money to drive, but it was so dangerous. We were saying that we really didn't want to drive the car because you couldn't, if you were coming up against a car down the straight, you would overtake. He's doing his 200 miles an hour. You're doing your 238. At one stage, the car did this, and I clipped the car. It just turned right on me. It was so dangerous, and all week Nissan was saying, yes, yeah, we'll sort it, and never did. And you know, that bastard thing lasted 24 hours with that bump steer. We had a gearbox problem about 3 o'clock in the morning. We lost 40 minutes, so we went from quite a reasonable position at the front of the field to 33rd, and then we drove the rest of it as hard as we could, and we got back to 14th, I think.
Right. I guess that 40 minutes was a bit of relief, I suppose, from the bumping. Wow. I mean,
And the other, pardon the expression, the other kick in the wotsits that Nissan did for us. I'd never finished Le Mans, and I was in the car with 30 minutes to go. The car's dying, the wheel bearings had gone, but it was still ticking along at flat out down the straight. And I get a radio call, box this lap. And I think there's nothing wrong with it. Well, I have fuel to go to the end. So I said, why? And they just said, box this lap. So, as I said, they're paying me a reasonable amount of money. You do as you're told. So I come in, and there, standing outside the car, they told me to get out. Was a guy called Aguri Suzuki, who was driving Formula One at the time.
He's in LaRousse and footwork, and
yeah. Well, he was driving the other Nissan, which had blown up. It broke its crank during the night, and he'd never sat in the car, hadn't qualified it or anything, and so he was basically making the car. He was doing something illegal. Anyway, they got me out, put him in it so a Japanese driver would finish the race.
Yeah, with Nissan,
you put all that effort in to do 23 and a half hours, and sadly, I told them what I thought. So,
well, I'm not surprised.
I got fired.
That's not. I mean, you can kind of see why they did it, but come on.
I mean, it should have been a bit more professional. They were paying me, and I should have shut up, and so I could have raced some more. But hey,
yeah, but after 23 and a half hours, for goodness sake. I mean, yeah. Anyway, yes, I didn't know that, but as soon as you said Aguri Suzuki, I knew what was coming. God dear. Just a comment from Carl Jones. Evening, Carl. It says,
Carl Jones.
Yeah.
Hello, John G.
That's very good.
Oh yeah. Well, he taught me well.
Yeah. I thought he'd phoned in then. No, no, he said, yeah, he's like bump steer would definitely get your attention, especially at that speed. Absolutely. Yes, it clearly did. I'm torn now because the car looked brilliant, but it was rubbish.
Well, I thought the chassis was built by March Engineering, and why they couldn't sort the geometry out, I have no idea. But you're at Le Mans for the whole week, and you had plenty of practice, night practice, and so on. But the car never changed the whole week, which was a shame.
And had the time to do it by the sounds of it, but hey, what a shame. I just want to sort of fast forward a bit really onto some of the more recent stuff, because it's been a couple of hours. It's flown by. It's been fantastic. But something I did sort of pick up on, and I heard about recently. You got into, but you've done. You're still racing. You've done some endurance racing at Silverstone, Snetterton, Britcar, and all that kind of a thing. There was a question earlier on. I believe it was from. Was it from Thomas Parker? I'll just have a quick scroll here. Sorry, folks. Yes, it was Thomas Parker. It was a while ago. You did a race in the British GT Championship, which is I think it's having a bit of a renaissance in the last couple of years. It's sort of picking up. Jensen Button's come in and done a bit and raised the profile. Was that a race that you enjoyed? I think you took third, did you not?
Yeah, I've done a few British GT races. I did one in a Dodge Viper.
Oh yeah, that's
Silverstone. That came about. I'd never sat in the car until the race meeting, because it was being driven by John Cleland with David Clark, and they've been doing very well in the car. But John Cleland had a falling out with the team, so the day before the race meeting, they were down to one driver, so they were looking for another driver, and they gave me a ring, which was very nice of them, Brook Speed. And I have to say, it was a little bit like racing a lorry with this huge V10 8-litre lump in the front, which was really, really heavy. And it took me a bit of time to get used to it. And David very kindly said, "Will you do the start?" And Oh, okay. So I'm right in the middle of the melee of all these British GT cars. And I can remember getting a very bad start because I just too much power and not enough skill. I dropped down the order a bit and came down to one of the slower corners. And I just thought, well, I'll just pop down the inside. And of course, the thing was so heavy, I couldn't get it stopped. So I had all four wheels locked on opposite lock down the inside, and everybody just went, and I came out at the front end of the field, which was great. And yes, we finished third, which was a fair result because, as I say, I didn't really get used to the car in such a short time.
Yeah, sure. Well,
And then I raced a Ferrari 430 with Duncan Cameron at Spa, Snetterton, and so on. So great motor racing, but that's all I've done in British GT.
It's a good thing to have done, because I just think it's really on the up from what I can see. I mean, it had a few years where it wasn't quite as appealing and things like that, and there's guys like Beechdean and Barwell have done really good jobs in
I
getting together.
I don't think I would do it now. The cars to me have no character. I drove Porsche contacted me and said, how would you like to be the oldest driver ever to race in Porsche Carrera Cup? So I said, fine, I'm in my mid-70s, so I'm going to be last. All these guys, it was the last round at Brands Grand Prix a few years ago, and 991 here. So,
I was there.
right.
Mm.
And I qualified 14th
Mm.
Out of 20, whatever it was. So at least I wasn't last. I thought I was going to be last, but I wasn't. But I had a lovely German engineer called Frank, and he had a computer, as the Germans do. And after my first practice, I had 2 half-hour sessions in the car on the Friday, and he said, come, Mike, come, we talk about the car. So he said, first thing he said was, what do you think of the brakes, Mike? And I said, well, the brakes are awesome. I'm going down towards Hawthorns. It's pulling 160 miles an hour-ish, and I'm not touching the brakes till 80 meters. And he said, yeah, I see on the computer here, 80 meters. And I said, I think that's sensational. He said, yeah. He said, but you're a bit old school, Mike. And I said, well, yes, I am old school. He said, yeah, basically in the dry, we don't touch the brake till 45 meters. I said, you're kidding me. He said, no, where you're braking at the moment is where we touch the brakes in the wet. And I said, well, that's totally impossible, Frank, because if I do that, I'm actually in the corner on the brakes. So therefore the car will rotate. No, he said. So I tried it, and he's absolutely right. If I'm honest, I probably didn't brake any later than about 55, 60 meters. But of course, then I had to turn into the corner I was doing left foot braking. I had to turn in with 100% braking on. And the car with its rear wheel steer and all its wonderful suspension just does it, just straight in. Incredible. The G it pulls is unbelievable. So I got within a second and a half of Dino Zamparelli's pole time, which I thought for a 75-year-old, whatever it was at the time, was okay.
Yeah.
But the car had no character to it.
Right.
The car didn't talk to me. The brakes felt dead. And I think they build these cars are so quick and so easy to drive. And I can understand why the manufacturers do it, because you have a rich owner who has a car and wants a professional driver to drive with him. The owner doesn't want to be that far away from the professional driver.
Yeah.
And I think these cars are so much easier to drive now that the disparity between a professional and an amateur is hardly anything now.
Yeah.
But they have no character, and I wouldn't want to race one again.
No, fair enough. And I remember I think it was it Dan Camish, the current British touring car driver. He said he got back in the Porsche and said, "Oh, it was really fast. It was great, but he probably felt the same as you. It just didn't. I don't know. He
They
couldn't really
don't
feel
talk
it.
to you. They don't talk to you.
Yeah,
If I drive the 956, or luckily I've raced different Porsches for Mr. Becker. I drove his 1974 3-litre RSR Porsche. It talks to me. I know when it's going to slide, and I can control it on the throttle. The brakes, I know when I'm going to lock the brake.
yeah,
With the Cup car, the only way I knew I'd locked a front brake is that a light comes on the dashboard and tells me I've locked a brake. Um, and
so yeah, electronic.
and as Frank says, I'm just old school, and that's why I will only race historic cars, because
Yeah.
they talk to me.
And there is nothing wrong with being old school. As I say, best eras. Um, just something I want to touch on. You were, excuse me, just going to find my notes here. 2008, you won the Brit Car title with Ian Lawson and with your son.
Yeah,
That must have been special.
it was. We won 2 championships for this. It's a little X-Works BMW British touring car that was modified to sort of world touring car spec.
Right.
And it was a great little car. It had a little 6-cylinder engine that revved to 10,000 RPM. So it felt and sounded like a proper racing car. And it was lovely to drive with my son and achieve wins together. I get very emotional even when Anthony was racing on his own in single driver events. He'd win a race and I'd get all choked up about it.
Of course.
But to win races in the same car was very, very special. We raced a Ferrari together in 2016, and we did a 4-hour race together at Snetterton, and we won it overall in a Class B car, because a lot of the Class 1 cars, Class A cars, had trouble. And Anthony and I roll off lap times within a tenth or two of each other. So there's not a quick driver and a slow driver. So we're consistently reasonably quick. And gave us an overall win, which was wonderful. And what I didn't realize, if you win a championship in a Ferrari invite you to a dinner at the end of the season, and they invite every driver that has won a championship in a Ferrari to the factory. And they put on this huge dinner, and they invite you up on the stage, and they have a massive screen, like a cinema screen, with video of you winning races in your Ferrari, and they present you with a trophy from the factory for winning the race, and it's in my office over there.
Wow, how lovely.
So it's very special. That was a very special moment to stand up there at Ferrari with my son was very special.
That's a classy touch. We like that.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
lovely. Really lovely. We're on the subject of Ferrari. I've got to bring this up. A comment. Will Picken, evening, Will. Well, I wasn't going to bring it up, but he's mentioned it. Goodwood 94, the Villeneuve Ferrari. What happened?
Nick Mason's always been very kind to me. I've raced his 250 GTO Ferrari. I've raced his 1934 Aston Martin. And I've driven his BRM P153, and he let me drive the 312 T3 that was Villeneuve's car that he won the Canadian Grand Prix in. Now, I demonstrated at Silverstone at the British Grand Prix, and he said, would I demonstrate it at the Festival of Speed? So I drove it on the Saturday. I did 2 runs. The car was fine. Now, the car is basically unrestored. And on the Sunday, I did exactly the same thing as I usually do, and just accelerated up past the house, it's sort of a straight with a slight left kink in it. But I got halfway from the right hander onto that straight and the house, and something broke on the rear suspension, and it
Oh,
just turned the car left, and that wouldn't have been so bad apart from the fact that there was a service road to the grand house. It's not there anymore. It's flat. But what they had was uh, stone curbings
right.
on the edge of the road, and I went sideways across the road trying to control the car after it had turned left, and it fell into the service road and
Oh, I
went
see.
across, hit the curb on the other side, and as it hit that, the curbing kicked the front wheel up and sliced into the monocoque,
Oh, I
which
see.
caused the car to take off. But as it sliced into it, it severed both my heels. And as it severed both my heels, it broke both my ankles
Oh,
and broke both my legs.
wow.
So then it came to a stop. But it took them about 40, 50 minutes to cut me out of the car. Um, so the worst accident I'd ever had, basically injury-wise, so I was in a wheelchair for over 10 months.
Wow.
Then tried to walk again, so I had to build me two new heels out of metal and so on and so forth. So it was a bad day, but I mean, Nick
Yeah.
was was great about it. Um, it's just one of those things. If something breaks, there's nothing you can do about it, and
Yeah.
that's why I said before. Um, Most of my accidents have been due to mechanical failure rather than driver error. I have made errors and I've had accidents because of it, but generally, I think I might have given up if they were all my fault. Um, it
I think
was
anyone would. Yeah. Yeah.
it was horrendous. Um, I got upset when some motoring journalists said that I'd just thrown the car away. Uh,
Yes.
I thought it was disrespectful to me because they didn't even talk to me about what happened.
Yeah.
So it was upsetting, but hey, I'm still walking. I've still got my legs, and
Yeah.
onwards and upwards.
And that's why these people talk about motorsport and don't drive.
Yeah,
Um, most of them don't know what you're talking. Don't know what they're talking about. Hands up. Um, but um, yeah, as I said, you're still doing historics. You're doing your tuition, and it's all going rather well, isn't it? It's all rather good.
yeah. I'm really busy. The one thing I'm amazed about, I wrote a book during COVID, and people said you've got an interesting. I mean, we've scratched the surface. There's lots of stories um, that I've written about in my book,
Mm,
and I didn't know whether people want to read it. Luckily, Guy Loveridge said he'd like to publish it. So we had 500 done, and they were all gone in 8 weeks. I was astounded. Um, so we're on the second rerun now, and I'm chuffed to bits that people want to read about it. And I've had some amazing reviews on the book. The most amazing one came from motoring journalists like David Tremaine, who write Grand Prix Plus, wrote the most amazing. It ran into almost 2 pages. Absolutely amazing review of my book, for which I'm eternally grateful. So I'm very proud of it
yeah.
because, to be honest, as a racing driver, as an author, I make a pretty good racing driver, not the other way around. But I had great help from Jeff Thomas.
Yeah.
Jeff, I couldn't have done it without Jeff. He edited the book for me, and I'm chuffed to bits with it. I'm very proud of it, and I'm glad that people enjoy reading it.
Yeah, absolutely rightly so. To crack it, I'm going to hold my hands up. I actually borrowed a copy. I've not bought one, but I'm going to. If you're on another run, I will have one. So
Good man,
absolutely,
good man.
yeah, definitely.
Know
I mean,
where
I
to
have read
find
it.
me.
Sorry. No, it is. No, it's a fantastic read. Just very quickly, another thing before we get on to some fun questions, just to finish up. Will Pickin, who asked about the Ferrari Goodwood thing, he said, on a happier note, Mike also drove my dad Nigel around Brands Hatch for winning a pace car design competition published in Autosport in 1979.
Wow.
So there you
I
go.
remember it. No, I don't. Oh, well, good for him. Good for him. I
Yeah,
think
good
it,
stuff.
because I did drive the pace car for the Indy races that came
Yes.
at Brands Hatch and Silverstone. That was a fun couple of weekends. And one little story: it rained at the IndyCar race at Silverstone, and AJ Foyt was leading at the time, and I came out in the pace car, and he pulled alongside me, even above the noise of the IndyCar. He was telling me to stop, get the race stopped, get the race stopped. It was hilarious. I've never had that happen before. I've driven the pace car a few times, and nobody has ever come alongside and tried to talk to me, especially from an Indy car.
Crikey. It's not like AJ Foyt to be outspoken. Goodness me. Never happens. No, wonderful. Right, we always sort of go through just some fun questions. Pretty similar ones every time, just to wind down. I mean, I could talk to you for hours, but we need to
Bless you.
trim it. But I think you might have mentioned it earlier, but did you have a favorite driver when you were growing up? I think you
Yeah.
mentioned one.
Yeah,
Was it
Ronnie Peterson,
Ronnie?
without doubt. I used to stand and watch on the outside of the old Woodcote that was sort of almost flat in a Formula One car, and to watch Ronnie put a Lotus 72 through there, the whole thing was just so close to the edge of disaster. Was astounding. His natural ability, and he was such a nice man. So yeah, he was my hero.
Yeah, lovely. And like, and when I spoke to Mario Andretti, he said the exact same thing. He said a wonderful driver and a wonderful man. And
Yeah, exactly.
can't really, if Mario says it, and if you say it, we'll take it.
I had the pleasure of meeting Mario because we both drove Reiner's Porsche 956 at the Festival of Speed up the hill, because he drove it at Le Mans, and I'd obviously sat on the same grid on a few Grand Prix with him, but at the other end. It was lovely to me. He was very generous with his time talking to me, and again, just a legend of the sport. Really, the word legend is used a lot, but he really is a legend in motorsport, and a very nice
all-rounders, definitely.
Yeah,
one of the best all-rounders ever. Just
yeah.
Lovely guy. This always a good one. Is there a driver you particularly sort of admire today, or that you like watching race today? I mean, there's a lot wrong with motorsport, but is there any one driver?
Do you know what? I have this big beef that I hate the lack of respect between race drivers nowadays.
Yeah.
Too much contact, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
It couldn't happen in our day because you had to. If I was racing against you in Formula 5000, I wouldn't want to put you in harm's way. So therefore, I drove with respect, and I would try and overtake you cleanly. If I couldn't, I wouldn't lunge you and put you in the wall, because it could have dire consequences.
Yeah.
One of the lads I enjoy watching, and it's not in some massive international motor racing, but I like watching Colin Turkington race, because Colin races touring cars with respect to his competitors, and I admire him being in that arena with such aggression going on, so much contact going on, but Colin seems to be able to still win with respect, and
he's clean. He's
Yep.
clean.
Yep.
Yeah, fully agree. The amount of people that say, "Oh, he's boring because he's not bumping into people."
He's motor racing as motor racing should be.
Yeah, I've always said it. I would, yeah, because you've got like a younger sort of breed of fan who thinks, "Oh, you know, and I don't mean this in a negative way against Ash Sutton or anyone else like that, but they're exciting and it's elbows out and then bumping, fantastic drivers. But as you say, Colin Turkington does it the way it should be.
Yeah, with
Brilliant.
respect.
Fantastic answer. Okay. Lisa Reinhardt asked a question a long time ago. It ties in nicely with this one. What's the best car you've ever raced and one that you'd love to race?
The one I've always wanted to race. When I was working for Firestone in the late 1960s, I was at Spa, and I became friends with a Swiss racing driver called Joe Siffert.
Yeah.
And Joe was driving at Spa in a Porsche 917, and I was doing the tire temperatures on his car for Firestone. And he came in after the first practice session, and I looked at him, and he came out to me, and I said, "How's the car, Joe?" And he just looked. He didn't say anything, but he just sort of undid his overalls, and he put his hand inside his overalls and just went like that, as though his heart was trying to get out of his body. And I could just imagine, because at the time, Pedro Rodriguez was lapping in the damp at an average of over 161 miles an hour around Spa, on the old Spa. And I'd always wanted to race a 917, and I've never had the chance to drive one. I've driven over 150 different racing cars. I've been so lucky that people have let me drive these wonderful things, but I've never sadly managed to drive a 917. So that's what I would like to have driven.
Yeah.
The best racing car, oh God, they've all been brilliant apart from the Nissan.
We just say not the Nissan. That's
if I can put it into categories, single seater, for instance, I think the Williams FW07C I won the British Open in is the best single seater racing car I've ever driven. It was so quick. It was just beautifully made. Quite dangerous because your feet were so far in front of the center line on the front wheels, but as long as you didn't crash going in forwards, the car was awesome, absolutely awesome, with a DFE singing in the back. It just did everything I wanted it to do, hence pole, fastest lap, and win the race. It was just wonderful. So single seater wise, I think sports car wise, the 956 I've been racing for Mr. Becker is probably the best racing car I've ever driven. It's just wonderful. It's so powerful. It handles, and sorry, my dog's coming to say hello. So I think that Porsche series, the 956s and the 962s, if ever you get the chance to get in one of those, they are, in my opinion, my humble opinion, they are the best racing cars in the world.
Brilliant. And if it's good enough for Derek Bell and you, then it's good enough for...
He was very kind to write the foreword for my book.
Wow, fantastic. There's another guy we need to have a chat with. But yeah, I mean, a fantastic car. And it's become like an iconic sort of car of the year, isn't it? So fantastic. There's a good... I don't think there can be an answer to this, surely. Kay Baker said, is there anyone you've nearly had a pit lane punch up with? Is that apart from the boss of Nissan?
No. There was a driver that my mechanic Colin Bennett had to pull me off at Brands Hatch. Now I'm a very placid guy. I'm not an aggressive person at all. Unless you race against me, then I'm quite aggressive to try and beat you. But
which someone actually said that right at the start of the chat. I forget who it was. Matt Kelly. Yeah, he said, "Don't be fooled by Mike's gentle persona. He's a very hard racer." The way it should be.
Matt and I had a wonderful race together. I'd never raced a Mini before, and Matt and I raced at the Mini Festival in Mini Coopers. And I'm afraid I lunged him. He was very, very gracious because he overtook me again, but it was a lot of fun, and I love Matt to bits.
Brilliant.
We've known each other for decades. He's a great driver, and he put up with me lunging him in the race.
Great stuff.
So the question was, again, I've forgotten. Oh yes,
Yeah.
Brands Hatch Formula 3, about 1972 or 1973. I was racing against an Irishman called Damien McGee, and Damien was. We bang wheels occasionally, and we were both aggressive, I suppose. But anyway, he hit me so hard as we went up to towards Paddock Bend at Brands Hatch. I was on the inside, he was on the outside. He hit me so hard that he spun me up the straight. And there used to be Armco, but well, in fact, there still is Armco barrier there. And I just managed to save the car from going in the barrel. I would have had mother and father of an accident. I was incensed because we were dicing up for the lead or second place. And I was so incensed that when the race finished, we went back in the paddock. I'm afraid my mechanic had to pull me off him.
The red mist descended, shall we say?
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. You can't put someone in the wall going, "What's Paddock
He
in bed?"
deserved a slap.
Yeah, it would have been a well-earned one. Yeah. So, okay. Final two questions. Final two. Is there anything that you'd love to have had a go at? Whether it was like IndyCar or the Australian supercars or NASCAR or anything as bonkers as that?
I would like to have tried IndyCar. I love IndyCar because of what they are. I hate all this carbon brakes, braking at the point of turning and braking to apexes. IndyCar used to run road courses with steel brakes, so you do 200 plus miles an hour, and on the road courses you would have to brake from 200 miles an hour, probably a couple of hundred meters. Yeah. So therefore you had a zone for fighting somebody for a corner.
Yeah.
And that appealed to me. So yeah, probably IndyCar. But if I'm totally honest, I'd love to have raced. I've raced so many different formulas. I'd love to race all formulas. So if I had the chance to go and do an Aussie V8, I would love to have done that. I did drive one in testing, but it would have been nice to have raced against, because those guys are good. Those guys are really good.
They're amazing.
And yeah, anything with four wheels, I would love to have raced, really.
Fantastic answer. Just on IndyCar, anyone who watches these, I always shoehorn IndyCar in there because it's my favourite and it always has been. I love it. I love it. Finally got to the Indy 500 last year, and wow.
Yeah.
Even if you're not a fan of IndyCar, just go and do it. It's incredible. There's nothing like it. Yeah. Right. Okay. This is a tough question. It's the final one. You've shared the track and raced against many amazing drivers. I've got a list. I'm just going to name some. I mean, you mentioned, we got David Hobbs and Brian Redmond, Guy Edwards, Peter Gethin, Tony Trimmer, Chris Amon, Derek Bell, Jackie Hicks, Carlos Reutemann. You shared a chat with Mark Donoghue, Beloff, Hans Stuck, Jan Lammers, Bob Wallett, even people like Gerhard Berger, Martin Brundle, John Watson, Scheckter, Peterson, Hunt, Fittipaldi, Hill, Andretti, etc. Is there anyone, apart from Ronnie, who kind of stands out as being not, the best or the toughest, or is there anyone there who you think,
wow? It's such a difficult question.
Yeah.
I raced against Stefan Beloff in World Sports Car races. I was in a different class to him, but to watch him, he was amazing, absolutely amazing. And sadly, I was in the race where he lost his life. But if I'm honest again, I don't think it's necessary to be the quickest, and I think Stefan was probably one of the quickest.
Yeah.
I love somebody. I've never been the fastest racing driver in the world, but I've been quite quick in everything I've driven. So I admire versatility. So I admire the Derek Bells of this world and the David Hobbs who drive Can-Am, Formula One, touring cars, whatever. If I have to name one, it's so difficult. I want to say Derek because Derek, I drove against him in Formula One. He's a good mate, and I drove against him in sports cars. But it's the same. I'd have to say Brian Redman because Brian I think is exceptional, as is Derek. Brian is one of the nicest men, as is Derek, that you could ever wish to meet. You put him in a Formula One, he does a brilliant job. You put him in a sports car, he does a brilliant job. And I love that versatility that they have. They're brilliant drivers and they're versatile. So I'd go, it's a toss-up between Derek and Brian.
Yeah. Well, we'll have both. Two fantastic drivers, as you say. You can drive anything, as you know, far better than I do. Well, it's been over 2.5 hours and it's absolutely flown by. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in. We're gonna draw a line there. As I said earlier, I could sit until 7 in the morning talking to you, but you can't do that.
And I could probably give you stories till 7 in the morning.
Sounds good to me. We'll carry on off air. No, we'll. But thank you to everyone who's tuned in and who's put comments in. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope we've covered everything that you guys have asked. And of course, to you, Mike, thank you very, very, very much for coming and having a chat. It's been fantastic. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Good. Thank you for asking me.
No, great stuff, and thank you for coming on. Yes, thank you very much, everyone. As I said, this has been recorded. It's going to be on our Facebook and on our YouTube in the videos and live section, respectively. So do go back and give it a watch when it's ready in about 15 minutes. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks again to you, Mike, and we'll see you all very, very soon. Take care.